First and foremost, right, let's talk about the real procurement itself before you go into how you're managing the supply chain of procurement, right?
Budweiser, Corona, Stella Artois, Hoegaarden. You must have heard of all these beers or have had it at some point in time. But do you know how its supply chain works and how it ends up at your doorstep? Today we have with us Viju Matthew. He's the Global Director of Analytics at AB InBev, the company that produces these beers and the largest brewer of beer in the world, to give a glimpse into how they are transforming their supply chain using the use of data analytics, AI and ML. Welcome Viju, how are you?
I'm great, and thank you, Kashyap, for this opportunity. Really appreciate it.
Fantastic. Okay, so I'm very excited for this podcast. I'm very passionate about beer. I have never understood what the supply chain logistics behind it is, but I'm glad that it ends up at my doorstep. But at the same time, I want to ask you, right? Before Anheuser-Busch became this bigger brand, or while it was growing to become this bigger brand, what is it that because it consists of all the perishable goods, beer consisting of the raw materials for it, including perishable goods. Before data and analytics, how did a company as big as AB InBev that was growing to such a scale manage their supply chain?
Yeah. No, great question, Kashyap, right? First and foremost, ABI is a company which has grown inorganically over the years, right? It was through mergers and acquisitions. If you look at our history, we have grown exponentially over the last 20 years because it's a mergers and acquisition that help us grow to the scale we are. So each of these companies, right, whether it's Modelo, whether it's Amber, whether it's AnheuserBusch in US, or the mothership in Europe, which has Stella and all of the portfolio, they were all companies which were managing it on their own ways, right? And obviously they were not using much of science. They had traditional tools. I can't say that they were not working without any science. They had science, but that catered to their operations of that scale. But when all these companies were put together and then we became the biggest brewer in the world, that's where the real challenge started, right? Because think about a company that produces pretty much 25% of the entire world's beer production, right? 1 out of 4 beer that you sell across the globe comes from our stable. That's where it becomes complicated, right? The so-called in-house tools or platforms that each of these companies had, or AnheuserBusch InBev, AB InBev had, that's not catering today's needs, the demands that we have, the presence that we have across the globe. That's why today we need to really invest in analytics, right? So typically, if you think about it, analytics resonates a lot with top line. We've been talking about analytics in sales and marketing over the last 20 years, a lot of maturity in that space. But over the last 10 years, there's a lot of attention on how analytics could be used could be leveraged to transform its bottom line. When I say bottom line, finance, your people, your supply, your logistics, your procurement, because for any company to be successful, you have to have 2 things, right? Either you should increase your revenue, very important. Equally, you should reduce your cost of production. And if you have to reduce the cost of production or if you have to reduce your overheads, you should use proper science in reducing your overheads, and that's where we play. And that's where we are here, building a lot of capabilities to transform its supply chain or bottom line of the company.
Fantastic. I think in supply chain, you mentioned before the podcast that there are 3 main pillars, right?
Yeah.
One is procurement, then comes logistics, and then comes supply. Let's take it step by step, right? First, let's talk about procurement. Beer consists of 4 main ingredients: barley, hops, yeast, and water. Of these, barley and hops are the most perishable ones, right?
Yeah.
Considering that these goods are perishable, but at the same time you are producing it at such a massive scale, how do you kind of manage your warehouse? How do you ensure the correct amount of procurement? Is there some kind of a cyclical nature where probably summers come, more beer is consumed, and do you plan your procurement accordingly? So how does that work, and what is the role of data in it?
Yeah. Again, let me give a bit of landscape of procurement in ABI, right? We are a 50 to 60 billion revenue company, given depending on the year that we are talking about. And pretty much we spend 40 billion on procurement, right? It's a huge spend on procurement. And imagine if what we could achieve by optimizing it by 1%. It's a huge number that we are talking about, right? And that's where analytics plays a huge role in procurement. First and foremost, right, let's talk about the real procurement itself before you go into how you're managing the supply chain of procurement, right? The biggest science or biggest area that we need to put a lot of science in transformation is in demand forecasting. We should know the exact demand of beer by geography, by demographics, at a supplier level, at a POC level, which is the point of consumption level, right? And that's a big challenge these days, right? Think about COVID. Nobody expected COVID and nobody knew how the customer behaviors will change. And beer is one commodity that's highly dependent on the weather even, right? If more summers means more beer, winters are not known for beer. So how will you create the best demand forecast that tells us how much beer will be sold in each geography, like not just a country, I'm talking about, at a very minuscule level. What is the demand of beer for every SKU, right? To making it complicated, we have around 500 SKUs across the globe. So 500 SKUs, millions of customers, as in not the end customer, but customers as in big retail chains and POCs to whom we are selling beer. It's a complicated operation, right? We need to take care of a lot of external factors, right? In these days, if you think about it, what is the unemployment index? How is the spread of COVID? How is the spread of, how is the weather patterns? How is the macroeconomic factors, right? All these factors need to be considered along with the changing, shopping patterns of our customers or liking of our customers. So that's where we need to bring a lot of science in, first of all, building a demand forecast that actually tells us what SKU is going to be sold at what volume at every geography and every microeconomic level, right? Every minuscule level. That's the first part. We are using a lot of science to define the demand, right? So once you know the demand of the raw materials or the beer, the second thing is then we need to actually forecast to produce this much beer, how much raw materials I need to procure. So that's the second forecast. So I know how much what is a SQX or Budweiser, right? I know how much Budweiser Magnum will be sold in India this month, right? And for that, then I need to forecast what amount of raw material I should have to produce that, right? And it's a very interesting space because many of these commodities are hedged. For example, corn, barley, diesel, a lot of these commodities are hedged. So we are not buying these commodities on a daily basis. We are hedging these commodities and we are buying long term. One of the solutions that we are building today is on commodity price forecasting and using commodity price forecasting to hedge these commodities in a better way. Let me give this example, right? We started this solution in Europe a year back, and that was the toughest year to start that project in Europe because last year we had a war in Europe, right? We had the Russia-Ukraine war in Europe. We saw a huge price escalation of all commodities in Europe, right? Price of every commodity like literally hit the roof. The inflation in Europe was like all-time high last year, and everybody was very skeptical that, guys, building the solution in Europe in a year with so much unpredictability, right? It doesn't make sense. But just on barley, last year, we made a savings of 6 million by building a barley price prediction model and using that solution for the long-term hedging of barley in Europe.
How long does it go back, this planning? So, home brewers usually take around 21 days to make a beer, but I don't think that's the similar kind of calculation that you need to make, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to that level of scale, what is the, usually it takes 3 to 4 weeks. So let's say you want to demand, so at what intervals do you buy your raw materials, and then how ahead in time have you bought it? So the prediction is for this thing.
So there are two things. One is once you hedge, you are buying for a whole year, right? You are talking about, you're having a commitment to a supplier saying, this is the price which I'm going to pay for this year, and obviously there will be certain clauses on what will be the price points at different points in the year. But buying is a long-term thing. We don't go and buy or negotiate on prices for our key ingredients or key raw materials on a monthly basis. It's a long-term prospect.
It's an annual thing.
It's an annual process of buying, right? This year, they are already talking about, we are looking at the predictions for next year, right? And we are looking at the hedging strategy for next year, and we are already making the contracts for next year, how we're going to buy our barley, hops, east and diesel and all of that, right?
The predictions come correct for this longer period?
Of course, it has to be, the predictions that we build needs to be that outward looking. It has to be literally a 6 months prediction, right? I'm not saying a 1 year prediction. It has to really look at next 6 months, how the price of barley is going to move, right? And barley's movement again is dependent on so much of microeconomic factors in the world, right?
Yeah.
What is the consumption of barley by other companies? How is the yield of crop of barley, looking at the weather patterns and other factors? How do you see the yield of barley happening? Is it going to be a year with great yield or a year with bad yield? So the predictions that we make has to be so powerful, so accurate, that it should have the power to say that over 6 months, how the price of barley is going to change across the globe, looking at each country that's producing barley, the macroeconomic factors including the weather and the conditions that's required to produce barley, global demand for barley, because we are not the only company which is using barley, right? The multiple companies using barley. With all these signs, we should tell what is the actual price points that we can expect for barley over the next 6 months to 1 year.
Okay.
And that science is used to to buy barley in advance.
Have you bought some land to grow barley, or you just buy barley?
No, it's a very interesting question again.
And do you grow your
I
own
don't.
hops?
Best of my knowledge, I don't think we do our own production of barley. But what we do is we support our farmers a lot. We work with our farmers. We have a lot of initiatives in going green and on that side of the business, where we work with our farmers. We introduce them to the best technological advancement in that space, best crop, best ways of yielding the crop, all of that. So we have a big team that works very closely with our farmers, so that it's of mutual interest for both of us, right? We are benefiting the farmers because they get to know the best crop to keep, the best techniques for growing barley, best techniques for getting the best yield of barley. That we are doing big time across the globe, even in India. But I don't think that we are actually going with the idea of like having 1,000 hectares of land and producing our own barley, which we don't do.
But yeah, and so this is from the procurement side of things, right? When it comes to the logistics of it, breweries are known to have a very big impact of the bullwhip effect, right? Barring the rare occurrence of a black swan event like COVID, because that I think kind of disturbed the supply chains of almost every industry. It in fact improved for some. But when it comes to beer, even if you make predictions, there is something or the other, like the war in Ukraine you mentioned, right? So there is slight deflection in the demand. Your supply might go waste or it may remain in shelves. Do you do something to do it in real time as well? How do you ensure that your logistics are evolving over the real time, and what is the role of predictive analytics and modern day data applications in this?
Again, very interesting question, Kashyap, right? So let's not talk about the production, that will cover at the very end, because it's a big topic, right?
It is happening in this.
So let's talk about the logistics side of it, right? So we kind of covered procurement, a lot of use cases which I can talk in procurement, multiple use cases in the procurement space. Let's talk about the logistics space. If I kind of club all your questions together, the science is around inventory management. How will you manage your inventories, right? First thing is all about production, because we talked about demand, and based on the demand, we produce beer, right? But the markets are very volatile. Like you said, we have a demand forecast, but sudden occurrences happen. There's a hurricane somewhere, there's a huge change in weather pattern somewhere, there is a strike happening in some country for a week, a country is closed for a week because of COVID, other issues, all of that. Anything can happen, right? So even the best science can help us with the best demand forecast, but is that forecast going to be accurate all the time on the ground? So that science always doesn't stay for long. So the science is, or the topic is, how are you managing the inventory in ABI? there are two things that we need to be careful of. One is deployment and the other one is redeployment. Deployment is nothing but once a beer is produced, right? What is the science that I'm gonna use to move the beer from breweries to the DCs, right? Because all the distribution to all the end customers and all of that happens from the DCs.
DC is distribution company.
DCs are the distribution centers, right?
Distribution centers.
So the first level of intelligence that any company has to build is on the deployment, right? So we have all the forecast at a higher level, like a geographical level. Here we need to really understand at a very minute level. If I am in Belgium, it's a small country, right? I have one DC. I need to know exactly how the demand is going to be in different retailers or in different pork chains in Belgium, right? Based on that science, I should be moving the SKUs or the stock from breweries to DCs, right? This is the first step, right? The complexity doesn't end here also. What you will see is that we use a lot of science in production, right? We'll use a lot of science in moving the beer from, breweries to DCs, assuming that this is a demand that I would expect in that DCs and all of that. That's where redeployment comes into picture. Redeployment is nothing but, first of all, I need to inform you that beer got only 6 months of shelf life, right? Yeah. And after 6 months, beer needs.
That's still a good time. 6 months. It's not like 6 days.
No, it's a decent time, right? It's a decent time. 6 months of shelf life. After 6 months, beer needs to be destroyed, and destroying beer is more expensive than producing beer, right? Because beer cannot be destroyed by just putting in the next, next ground or next somewhere.
How do you get access to this beer that is almost about to be destroyed?
For you to buy.
Not buy, just but yeah.
For your own consumption. Cool. So the interesting fact is the cost of destruction of beer is much more than the cost of production sometimes, because we need to destruct it very economically friendly, environmentally friendly, right, in an ethical way, right? So we were talking about the science up to deployment. We moved our stock to our DCs, and suddenly what we are finding is that, the macroeconomic factors again changed. The DC which has 10 hectoliters of beer Hogarden doesn't require 10 hectoliters of Hogarden anymore, because suddenly we are seeing a huge shift in pattern in the customer behavior on the ground. So that's where redeployment comes into picture, right? Redeployment is nothing but how will you move beer from DCs to DCs or customers to customers,
okay,
right? Which means that the beer which I moved from brewery to DC, now I know that it's staying there for 3 months and there are only 3 months of life, and I'm finding that the factors changed on the ground. There need to be a science on moving it again to a different location. It could be a different country, right? In that case, we need to, it's like an optimizer, right? We need to look at factors including the importing cost. If I'm moving from one country to another, I have to look at, can I still move beer from one DC to another DC in another country or in another location? If it's in another country or another location, you look at the logistics cost, the cost of movement, the cost of excise and all of that, because there is a lot of import taxes and export taxes all attached. After doing all this, can we still make a macro, positive macro if I move this beer, right? So what we are building there is an optimizer which kind of takes care of pretty much thousands of variables,
yeah,
and tells us what is the science in moving beer from DCs to DCs or brewery to breweries with an idea of having a positive macro after doing all these things.
Okay.
So that's a science that we are using, right?
Yeah.
A lot of optimization on deployment and even more optimization on redeployment.
Yeah. So, but this is logistics. So, how is supply analytics different than logistics? You said there are procurement, logistics, and supply. What is?
In our world, supply means manufacturing.
Okay, manufacturing.
Right.
Okay. So, but it comes before logistics.
It comes before logistics. So
okay,
we procure, we produce.
So which is supply?
supply, and then we
Yeah, so in
get
that, right, in terms of supply, the manufacturing, there must be a lot of newer technologies that you might be using, right, in terms of IoTs
Yeah.
and, some edge devices and all of that. What is it that during the supply, what is some of the analytics used? Also, what is the problem statement that you are trying to solve? Because you have already decided the amount of beer that you want to produce. That's how you do the procurement. So what is the problem statement you are trying to solve, and what are some of the technologies that are used in the
Yeah.
supply or slash
Yeah.
manufacturing side of it?
The entire, the journey of beer starts from a brewery, right? We have around 266 to 280 breweries across the globe. Even in India, we have breweries, the nearest one being in Mysore, which kind of produces most of the beer that we see in India, right? The Budweiser that you buy, or the Hogarden, or Corona that you buy in India, in South India, it comes from the brewery in Mysore, right?
Okay.
So let me tell you a bit about the brewery landscape, right? So we have around 260 to 280 breweries across the globe, and we are at a state where we have huge out of stocks because we are not able to meet the demand of beer with the current number of breweries that we have, right? And the key leading KPI for a brewery is called GLY, gross layout yield. So to make it very simple, it talks about the health of a brewery with respect to its ability to produce, right? What is its efficiency to produce beer in the most effective way? Today, if I take the GLY, gross layout yield, of the breweries in ABI across the globe, there is a huge opportunity for us to improve those numbers, right? None of the breweries are running at 100% GLY. Forget about 100%, 80% itself is like a difficult number to achieve, right? So if you can improve the GLY inside a brewery, right, you can significantly increase your production of beer, right? All the breweries are running 24/7. There are 3 shifts happening in all breweries across the globe. In spite of all breweries running 24/7 across the globe, we see that there's a huge out of stock, right? Because we are not able to beat the demand that we have. So what if I can improve my efficiency of a brewery by 1%? That could be hundreds of millions of dollars in additional revenue for the business.
That kind of margins you are talking about.
Not margins are good, but more than that, if I can improve my GL by 1%, I'm going to produce much more beer from the same brewery, right? So that's where planning in brewery comes very important.
Do you also use it to kind of analytics to predict which flavor or brand might work best for which demography?
There is a lot of studies happening in that space,
Yeah.
on customer behavior, customer liking, but that doesn't come into the supply
chain.
analytics. It's more of a research and marketing side, right? On the supply side, we don't do that research. Supply is all about manufacturing, right? They don't think about, definitely a lot of science is happening in this space, but it's not in the supply space. So it's more of research on the customer side, right? So coming back to the brewery side, if I can improve my brewing by 1%, and if you can improve my planning in a brewery by 1%, right, I'm going to produce more beer, which means more revenue for the business, right? This is one thing. Second thing is, if you look from outside, brewing sounds like a very easy process, right? Water, hops, barley and yeast, you ferment it and you get beer, right? And the main ingredient for beer across the globe is these 4 ingredients. And with just these 4 ingredients, have you tasted beers with a lot of flavors and lot of
we live in Bangalore. So.
We live in Bangalore. So every beer is known for certain characteristics.
Yeah.
You may not be counting all these characteristics when you are drinking a beer, but you like a beer because of its flavor,
Yeah.
The smell of a beer, the aroma, the density of the beer, the carbon content in a beer. There are like 100, unique identification factors for a beer.
IBUs, ABVs.
So many things, right? And brewing is actually a very complicated process,
Yeah.
right? every batch of brewing doesn't go well. And if you don't do brewing properly, we get to a place where we'll end up producing the beer and it doesn't meet the requirements of that specific beer, and we have to just, throw away that beer. And that's where a lot of science is being built in ABI. So let me talk a little bit about an interesting topic called fermentation curve optimization, right? Fermentation curve optimization is nothing but once you have all these raw materials in a specific amount, once it goes to the boiler, right, it ferments for sometimes 6 days to 14 days, right? And let's talk about the old process. So the fermentation is happening. Obviously, there are a lot of science there. There are equipments with a lot of parameters that we can adjust. And the brewmaster, every few hours, he takes a sample of the beer and checks whether the fermentation curve is kind of adhering to the standards that we want it to adhere to, and he kind of adjusts the parameters of the boiler to ensure that it's working well. But what we have seen is that in spite of that manual process, sometimes you don't get it absolutely right. We have built a solution called fermentation curve optimizer that takes all the variables from this equipment on a real time, and on a real time basis, it's actually predicting whether the fermentation curve is meeting the exact curve or not. In the previous world, a brewmaster was taking ad hoc samples, he was doing the testing, then he was manually changing all the settings. From there, we have gone to a world where IIoT, we were talking IIoT, with thousands of variables being captured from the sample on a real-time basis or near real-time basis, analytics on the fly, telling how the fermentation curve is progressing, giving us alarm signals, and telling us what variables should be changed, what parameters should be changed to what settings, so that the beer that we get, right, is of the same taste. One thing which I proudly can tell about ABI, right, from my experience, you can always challenge it. The Budweiser that I drink in India and the Budweiser I drink in Mexico or US or in Israel, I have found that they taste absolutely same.
0% difference, yeah.
But many of the other products which I taste in different parts of the world, it doesn't taste the same. For us, ensuring the same experience for our customers, for all the products who are expecting something from our products, it's very important. And that's why we are using a lot of science in manufacturing. Apart from the things that you would obviously imagine, right? Predictive maintenance, predictive energy, right? Water consumption, a lot of science is being used. But I think these are use cases that you would have been knowing, because every company has a predictive maintenance suite, every company has an energy optimization suite, right? Water optimization suite, which we also have, we have developed big time. But beyond that, the focus for us today is how to optimize the production, which means how to improve the yield of a brewery by improving the GLY or the gross layout yield, by improve the planning process in the brewery. And second thing is, how will you optimize the fermentation curve to produce beer of the highest quality?
Fantastic. I think it's been a very interesting talk. Thank you so much, Viju, for coming to the podcast. It's a very interesting insight into what it takes to brew that number of. How many liters of beer is sold in a year?
Tough question, man. I wouldn't know that question. It's a 55 to 60 billion revenue company. So, and pretty much 1/4 of all beer sold across the globe belongs to us.
Yeah.
One out of four beer sold across the globe comes from our breweries.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Viju, for coming today. I hope everybody has a good insight into how Budweiser or beers kind of reach your doorstep. Drink responsibly. Thank you.
Thank you.